Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking some seriously complex, heavy source material to look at the massive gap between what global military and economic powers say they intend to do and the brutal reality Syrian civilians actually face on the ground. We're going to dig into extensive reports from human rights organizations and on-the-ground data to map out exactly how both military campaigns and international financial policies have completely reshaped the lives of millions.
Let's kick things off with the visceral, first-hand memory of Abu Ahmed. He's a 60-year-old man who was just out distributing water in the city of Raqqa during Ramadan. He was walking with a friend and a young displaced Iraqi child. And then, in a fraction of a second, a sudden airstrike literally shatters his reality. He remembers being violently thrown to the ground, totally losing his ability to speak, and feeling the immediate suffocating closeness of death before he finally managed to gasp for air in the pitch black.
When his vision finally cleared, he was met with his entire neighborhood, including his own shop, just reduced to smoke, dust, and burning rubble. Starting with Abu Ahmed's story instantly grounds us in the intense, physical stakes of this conflict. Before we get into all the macro-level data and the geopolitics, we have to remember that every single statistic we're about to discuss represents a human life fundamentally, irreversibly altered in an instant.
To really grasp how both kinetic military force and invisible economic policies completely reshaped Syria, we're going to follow this roadmap. We'll look at the civilian cost of war, patterns of military strikes, the humanitarian aid paradox, and finally, the path to accountability. Let's get right into it. Section 1. The civilian cost of war, micro and macro devastation.
Behind all the geopolitical headlines about the campaign to push ISIS out of Raqqa, Amnesty International documented these absolutely devastating micro-level stories. Take the Al-Tadfi family, 10 of them, sheltering in a basement in the city center, wiped out by a midday strike just an hour after a relative dropped off insulin for his mother. Or the Murbads, 10 family members killed, literally stepping out of their door to flee a different strike next door. And wow, the Badran family. They lost 39 members, including baby Tulip, who was just months old, while desperately running from place to place within besieged neighborhoods, trying to escape U.S.-led coalition strikes.
Now, zooming out to the macro level, the source data on the Russian military intervention over the last decade shows a truly systemic scale of loss. Al Jazeera highlights documentation showing nearly 7,000 civilian deaths. And get this, over half of those happened in the very first year of the intervention alone, including over 1,000 children. But the sources emphasize it's not just the sheer loss of life, it's what was targeted. We're talking 224 schools and 217 medical facilities. They were hitting the actual foundations of civilian society.
Moving on to Section 2, Patterns of Military Strikes, Munitions and Denials.
So in the intense drive to push ISIS out, coalition forces used staggering firepower. The sources show U.S. soldiers, stationed tens of kilometers away, rained down somewhere around 30,000 artillery shells on Raqqa. The result of that? Close to 80% of the city was left in absolute ruins. That's a level of urban destruction that's honestly hard to even wrap your head around.
But here's the thing, despite destroying 80% of the city, the U.S.-led coalition initially admitted to causing exactly 23 civilian deaths in their entire Raqqa campaign. Just 23. It wasn't until Amnesty International published their intensive field investigations that the coalition quietly added 77 more deaths to their tally. That's a 300% increase, sure, but human rights researchers point out that the coalition still treats these as isolated incidents. They persistently deny the wider pattern of mass casualties that the on-the-ground evidence clearly points to.
Looking impartially at the data from our sources, there's a fascinating, tragic overlap in tactics here. Both international actors used highly destructive munitions right in the middle of densely populated civilian zones. The U.S.-led coalition relied heavily on unguided artillery shells with a margin of error of over 100 meters. In a packed city, that means a shell could land a whole football field away from its intended target. On the flip side, Russian forces systematically dropped unguided bombs in busy areas, like a morning market in Ariha that killed 49 people, and they deployed inherently indiscriminate cluster munitions. Both approaches caused catastrophic collateral damage that completely contradicted their claims of precision strikes.
Which brings us to a really crucial legal concept human rights organizations argue applies directly here, a prima facie case of an international humanitarian law violation. Basically, that means there's enough evidence right on the surface to presume a violation occurred. The sources emphasize that field investigators consistently found evidence of civilians killed in areas with absolutely zero military targets or fighters present at the time of the strike. It's not just that civilians happened to be caught in the crossfire, it's that there was a complete lack of military justification for the specific strikes that killed them. All right, shifting gears entirely to Section 3, the humanitarian aid paradox, sanctions and bureaucracy.
Broad international sanctions, like the U.S. Caesar Act and various EU embargoes, were originally designed to pressure the Syrian government and put a stop to human rights abuses. But sources like the Forced Migration Review highlight a massive, unintended paradox. These sanctions have severely restricted the ability of aid agencies to help the estimated 6.8 million internally displaced Syrians. So the very policies meant to protect civilians are actually choking off their humanitarian lifeline.
To understand exactly how this happens, we need to talk about a banking practice called de-risking. Global banks are absolutely terrified of accidentally tripping over complex, overlapping international sanctions and getting hit with massive financial penalties. So, to protect themselves, they de-risk. They just flat out refuse to process any money going into Syria, even if that money is from a totally legitimate aid agency trying to fund a hospital or buy food for refugees.
It creates this devastating bureaucratic domino effect. Global powers enact broad sanctions and anti-terror measures. Terrified banks heavily de-risk and cut ties to avoid fines. And then, aid agencies on the ground suddenly hit a wall of paralyzing red tape. They have to prove over and over that their money won't touch anyone sanctioned. The ultimate outcome? Emergency humanitarian funds are effectively blocked, or at least severely delayed from entering the country. Aid groups are basically forced to run their operations based on financial risk assessments instead of, actual human needs on the ground. And this paradox hit a deadly peak after the devastating 2023 earthquakes. Over 4,400 people were killed in northwest Syria alone. While people were literally trapped under rubble, aid groups outside the country were desperately fighting through banking bureaucracy just to wire emergency funds to their local staff to buy rescue equipment. The sanctions drastically slowed down the emergency response right when hours and minutes literally meant the difference between life and death.
This brings us to our final part, Section 4, the path to accountability. Justice and reparations.
The sources highlight some incredibly systemic roadblocks to actually getting justice here. On one side, the U.S. Department of Defense refuses liability and offers zero compensation, treating the few deaths they do admit to as the end of the matter rather than the start of a real investigation. On the other side, Russia has used its UN Security Council veto an astounding 18 times to actively shield the Syrian regime from international accountability. And on top of all that, the organizations actually out there trying to document these realities face non-stop smear campaigns designed to discredit their work.
So overcoming these roadblocks takes way more than just apologies or diplomatic statements. The sources outline that true transitional justice needs 3 core pillars. First, independent fact-finding to establish a permanent historical record. Second, actual criminal accountability, meaning commanders are held legally responsible for striking civilian areas. And third, comprehensive financial reparations. And we don't just mean individual payouts. We mean providing the real resources needed to physically rebuild that 80% of Raqqa and the hundreds of schools and medical facilities that were systematically targeted. So here's the absolute crucial point I want you to take away from this explainer today. As global powers look to the future and talk about political transitions or normalizing relations, we really have to ask, can there ever be true, legitimate peace without first delivering genuine accountability and reparations for the millions of Syrian civilians caught in the crossfire? Based on the sources we unpacked today, without justice, any peace might just be an illusion. Thanks so much for joining me to break this all down. Until next time, keep seeking the facts.